You know the name Menendez brothers, right? You probably remember all those headlines.
Yeah.
But this story is far from over. It's actually maybe even more complex today, more relevant now than ever before. So get ready, because today we're going to deep dive into all this source material, court documents, recent interviews. We're going to see what's changed since 1989 and what might be next for these convicted murderers.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. This case has always been fascinating to people, but it seems like the conversation is different now. It's like now we're focused on their lives in prison, the abuse allegations that were part of their defense,
Hmm.
and there's new evidence that could change everything.
But right, I think most people remember the basics, the murders, the trials, the life sentences.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to this whole thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. To see where we are now, we need to go back and look at those big moments. Back in August 1989, Lyle and Eric Menendez, they were 21 and 18. They shot and killed their parents, Jose and Kitty, in their Beverly Hills mansion. The brutality of the crime, the family's wealth, and then the brothers just spending money afterward like it was nothing. The whole country was just captivated.
And their defense was all about years of abuse. They said their mother knew about it. It was a really controversial defense.
Hmm.
And the first trials, they were separate for each brother, ended with hung juries.
Exactly. And those trials brought up so many questions about wealth and privilege and how complicated abuse can be. But the second trial was different. One jury, limits on the abuse testimony. And in 1996, both brothers were found guilty. They got life in prison, no parole.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of people think the story ends. But what's happened since then is really interesting. For one thing, the brothers aren't separated anymore.
Hmm.
After more than 20 years in different prisons, they were reunited at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego in 2018.
It was a powerful reunion. A family spokesperson said that Lyle just started crying when he saw Eric. And this reunion changed a lot more than just their connection. It really changed how their lives are in prison.
Oh, really? How?
Well, they're in a place called Echo Yard. It's a non-designated programming facility, which means it's less restrictive than general population, more freedom to move around, and access to programs like yoga, art classes, support groups.
So it's still prison, but it's not that harsh, isolated place people imagine.
Right. And it shows they haven't caused any big problems. They've actually focused on personal growth, even helping other inmates.
Okay, so what does that look like? What are their days like?
Well, Eric works with inmates who are terminally ill. He leads religious study groups. And he paints. They even had a plan for him and Lyle to paint a mural on the prison walls. But Lyle's been really involved in inmate government and prison reform advocacy.
Painting and prison reform. That's not what you usually think of when you hear Menendez brothers.
It's a good reminder that people are complex. Even if they've done terrible things, they can change, grow. It doesn't excuse their crime, but it makes their story more complicated.
Yeah, and this is where the narrative starts to shift. It's not just about them inside. It's about their connections to the outside world. Both of them are married now to women they met while in prison.
That's right. They've stayed in touch with the outside through letters and calls, and now they have tablets so they can communicate with approved contacts. Eric married Tammy Ruth Sackerman in 1999. They were pen pals first. Tammy even wrote a book about their relationship. Lyle's been married twice in prison. His second marriage is to Rebecca Sneed. That was in 2003.
That's a really interesting detail. It changes how we see them, but of course they can't have conjugal visits because of their crimes. How do they make their marriages work with those limitations?
Lyle has talked about that. He said he and his wife focus on talking to each other, emotional intimacy, to make their marriage healthy even though they can't be physically together.
Wow, that's resilient. It goes back to what you said before about how complex their story is. They're not just these true crime figures. They're people with relationships, desires, goals.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember this when we look at the new evidence that's come up. This is where things get really interesting. This could change everything.
Yeah, let's talk about that. In 2023, their attorneys filed a petition to vacate their convictions.
Yeah.
Basically, they want the court to throw out the guilty verdicts, maybe give them a new trial.
Right. And this petition is based on two main pieces of evidence.
The first one is testimony from Roy Rosello. He used to be in that boy band Menudo.
Rosello was a teenager back then, and in a documentary series from 2023, he said that Jose Menendez drugged and raped him. Jose Menendez was a record executive then. This is big because it supports what the brothers said about being abused.
So it's not just their word against their parents anymore. Someone else is saying their father was abusive. And not just anyone. Someone who knew Jose Menendez professionally.
Exactly. And then there's the second piece of evidence. A letter that Eric wrote to his cousin. just 8 months before the murders. Their aunt, Marta Cano, found this letter. In it, Eric says he's afraid of his father and hints that the abuse is still happening. It's a really disturbing letter, and it matches what he said later in court.
That letter is so important. It shows that Eric wasn't making up the abuse claims after the fact. He wrote about it before the murders. It makes his defense a lot more believable.
Yeah, and the timing is key. It shows that his fear was getting worse and worse before the murders. That could be really important for the judge's decision.
So we've got this new testimony saying Jose Menendez was abusive, and this letter from Eric talking about his fear. This paints a totally different picture than the spoiled rich kids narrative, the one that was everywhere in the media at first.
Absolutely. It shifts the focus from greed to survival. Not cold-blooded murder, but maybe a desperate act after years of trauma.
And this new evidence has gotten a lot of attention, even for people like Kim Kardashian. She visited the brothers in prison, and she's been supporting their release.
Yeah, having her involved has definitely made more people aware of the case and interested in whether the brothers might be released.
And then there's the recommendation from the Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon. He recommended resentencing the brothers, which could mean they'd be eligible for parole.
That's a huge development. After decades in prison, there's a chance they could get out.
So we went from a case that seemed closed to a situation where these guys might actually be released. What does this mean for them? What's next legally?
That's the big question. It's all up to the judge now. They have to decide whether to give them a new trial, reduce their sentences, or leave things as they are. And that's what we'll be talking about next.
This is where the case gets even more interesting. We're not just talking about the past anymore. We're talking about a totally different future for the Menendez brothers.
It brings up a lot of legal and ethical questions, and we need to look at those carefully.
So the judge is the one who has to decide now. It's all on them. If this new evidence is enough to reopen the case, or maybe change their sentences. So what are the options? How likely is each one?
Well, the biggest change would be if the judge decided to have a whole new trial, like starting over. New jury, new witnesses, the whole thing. It doesn't happen very often, especially this long after the first convictions.
But it's possible though, right? I mean, this new evidence is not like some small technicality. These are big claims, the kind that could have made a jury decide differently back then.
Yeah, you're right. The defense could say that if the jury had known about this evidence in the first trial, the result might have been different, especially Eric's letter. It shows this pattern of fear and abuse, and what Rosello said makes the brothers' claims even stronger.
It seems like it would be a big risk for the prosecution to do a whole new trial, with all this new stuff supporting the abuse defense.
Oh, definitely. And we have to remember that in a criminal trial, they have to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So even with this new evidence, the prosecution still has to convince a jury that the brothers were motivated by being mean and wanting money, not by fear for their lives.
It makes you wonder what the prosecution would even do in a new trial. Would they say Rosello isn't telling the truth? Or focus on other evidence, things that show they planned it out and wanted the money?
It's hard to know for sure, but it would be a tough case for them. Public opinion has changed a lot since the 90s. People are more aware of how abuse affects people, especially young men.
Yeah, and the defense would probably use that. They'd say the brothers were victims who did something desperate.
Exactly. So a new trial is possible, but it's not the most likely outcome. The judge might go with something less extreme, like reducing your sentences.
Okay, so what would that be like?
Basically, the judge could make their sentences shorter. So maybe they'd be eligible for parole right away, or sometime soon.
So they could get out even without a new trial.
Yeah, that's right. The judge could say that because of this new evidence, they should reconsider the original sentence. They could say the brothers have been in prison long enough, and that they've changed for the better while they've been there.
And that decision would probably include looking at how they've behaved in prison, right? All the work they've done with other inmates, being in those programs, and how they've basically become good members of the prison community.
Absolutely. All of that would matter to the judge. The fact that they haven't caused problems, that they've focused on improving themselves and trying to help other people.
This all makes me think back to what we talked about, but their lives in prison and the programs and even their marriages. Now all that stuff is even more important because it could affect the judge's decision.
It's really interesting, isn't it? All these different pieces of information could come together and affect the legal outcome.
So tell me more about these marriages. It's not something you usually hear about in big murder cases. How do these relationships even happen?
Well, both brothers have been writing letters to stay connected to the outside world. That's how Eric met his wife, Tammy. They started writing to each other, developed a relationship that way, and got married in 1999.
And Tammy's been really outspoken supporting him, right? She even wrote a book about their relationship.
Yeah, she has. The book gives you a different way of looking at their connection and how hard it is to stay married when one person is in prison, but also the good things about it.
What about Lyle? His situation's a little different.
Yeah, Lyle's actually been married twice while he's been in prison. His first marriage to Anna Erickson ended in divorce. He's been married to Rebecca Sneed since 2003, though, and it seems like they have a really strong relationship.
I read that Rebecca has been really supportive of Lyle, helping him with his appeals and even running his social media from outside prison.
She's really important in his life. She's advocating for him and helping him stay connected to the outside world.
Shows that even though they're in prison, they can still have real relationships, deep ones that mean something.
It shows how much people need connection, even in situations like that.
But these relationships must be hard. No conjugal visits, plus everyone's watching them. The public and the media. It must be a lot of work to keep a marriage going when it's like that.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Lyle's actually talked about that. He said that he and Rebecca focus on communicating and being emotionally close to make their marriage strong, even though they can't physically be together.
So even though they're apart, they've found ways to be close in a way that goes beyond what we usually think of as marriage.
Exactly. And this could be really important for the judge when they're trying to decide if the brothers have changed enough to go back into society.
It just goes to show that every part of their lives, even their personal relationships, could be looked at when the judge is deciding whether to release them.
That's right. And this leads us to the third possible outcome. The judge could decide to keep things the way they are, uphold the original convictions, and not change their sentences at all.
So even with all the new evidence and what the DA said, the judge could say the original verdict is still right.
That's right. The judge could say that even though this new evidence is interesting, it doesn't change the basic facts of the case or what the jury decided before.
That would be a huge letdown for the brothers and everyone who supports them after all this time and all these new developments to end up back where they started.
It would be really hard for them, and it shows you how unpredictable the legal system can be, even when there's new evidence.
And for the brothers, it would mean staying in prison for life, knowing that their fate is completely in the hands of one judge.
It's a lot to deal with, but it also shows how powerful the judicial system is.
Okay, so we've got three possibilities. A new trial, shorter sentences, or keeping things the same. What do you think the judge will focus on most when making their decision? What are the main arguments each side will probably make?
Yeah, it feels like we're waiting for a big decision. The judge has all this information to consider, stuff from decades ago, but also all this new evidence. What are the biggest things they'll be thinking about? Well, it's complicated legally. The defense is probably going to focus on how much this new evidence changes things. They'll say it shows a whole different side of the story. They'll point to Rosella's accusations and that letter from Eric as proof that the brothers were abused, that they were acting out of fear, not greed.
So they're basically saying the brothers should get a new trial, or at least a much shorter sentence,
Yeah.
because the first jury didn't know everything.
Exactly. They'll probably talk about how people view abuse differently now than they did back then. What might have been ignored or downplayed in the 90s is now seen as a serious problem, especially for young men.
It's true.
Right.
How much things have changed in the last few decades. Stuff that used to be taboo or embarrassing is now talked about openly.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the defense will probably use that to their advantage. They'll say the brothers deserve another chance, that we should see their actions in a different light now.
But what about the prosecution? What will they say to counter that? I'm sure they have good reasons to keep the convictions the way they are.
Of course. They'll probably focus on how brutal the murders were, how much planning went into it, and the fact that the brothers stood to inherit a lot of money. They'll say that no matter what abuse might have happened, the brothers still chose to kill their parents in cold blood.
And they might try to say the new evidence isn't reliable, right? Like maybe Rossello isn't telling the truth, or that Eric exaggerated in his letter, or that it was taken out of context.
Yeah, that's probably what they'll do. They'll try to make the judge doubt the new evidence, remind them that a jury already decided the brothers were guilty, based on what they knew at the time.
It seems like it's going to come down to two different stories. The defense will say it was about abuse, fear, desperation, and the prosecution will say it was about greed, planning, and cold-blooded murder.
That's it exactly. And the judge has to look at all the evidence and the law and decide which story makes more sense, which one fits better with the idea of justice.
And it's not just about legal stuff, is it? There's also the emotional side of this case, how it's affected so many people, the victims' families, the brothers themselves, and the public. Everyone's been fascinated by this story for decades.
It's a case that's made us think about some pretty deep and disturbing parts of human nature, about abuse, trauma families, and whether we can ever really forgive someone.
And no matter what the judge decides, those questions will still be there. This case isn't just about the Menendez brothers. It's about how we as a society deal with these big, complicated issues. Justice, accountability, redemption.
It's a conversation that goes way beyond the courtroom. It makes us think about our own beliefs and prejudices, what we think is right and wrong, and how we judge other people.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We've gone beyond the headlines and the sensationalism and looked at the human side of this story.
And we've seen how new information can change how we see the past. It makes us question what we thought we knew and face some uncomfortable truths.
It reminds us that even cases that seem over can change. New perspectives can come up. And justice is something that keeps evolving. It's not just a one-time decision.
So what about you, listening right now? Has this changed how you think about the Menendez brothers? Do you think they deserve a second chance? And what does justice really mean in a case like this, one that's so complicated and emotional?
Those are questions that stay with you even after the podcast is over. They make you think and talk about them and examine your own values and beliefs. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Menendez brothers. Until next time, keep digging deeper, keep asking questions, and keep an open mind.